I always keep going on about latency this, latency that, 10 milliseconds is pretty bad, 20 milliseconds is basically unflyable. And the response is usually, it's not that bad, doesn't matter to the average person anyways. Which is a pretty logical and reasonable thing to think, because 10 or even 20 milliseconds is really such a minuscule amount of time. If you compare it to, for example, the average human reaction time, which is somewhere around 150 milliseconds. So, how much can 10 milliseconds really matter? Well, let's find out. When comparing anything regarding latency, you always have to measure the end-to-end latency. So not only just the video latency, but the full end-to-end latency. So that's the video latency, the control link latency, and also the pit loop latency. And the absolute lowest you can have on an FPV drone is right around 15 milliseconds. But to achieve that, you need everything to be perfect. You need one of the goated goggles, you need a low latency camera, you need a very good pit tune, you need 500 Hz ELRS, and you need to disable RC smoothing or set it to something very low. And to visualize how much 15 milliseconds really is, let's take a look at this dive. And if I enable the trails feature, which is currently set to every 15 milliseconds, you can see how much you travel within that 15 milliseconds. And basically your IRL drone is always one drone ahead, and what you see is always one drone behind of where you really are. And at 15 milliseconds it's about half a drone length or maybe one drone length if you're going a bit faster. Next step up is 25 milliseconds latency. And that is if you take the previous setup and you just replace the analog system with a DJI O4 system and you turn on race mode. And 25 milliseconds is this much. Then the next step up is 35 milliseconds, and this can be achieved many different ways. Either you can disable race mode, or if you're flying analog and you have a high latency camera or a high latency goggle, or if you have high RC smoothing. There are many different ways to achieve 35 milliseconds, and it looks like this. And of course, if you combine multiple of the bad things, like a high latency camera and a high latency goggle, then you can get up to 55, which looks like this. Or of course, if you combine even more, like also enabling RC smoothing, you can easily go into the 70s, which gets pretty bad. But in this test, I'm only gonna test up to 55 because that's still reasonable and doesn't feel completely horrible. And the test setup works like this. I have a predefined freestyle route, which I'm gonna fly on each latency, and I'm gonna track how many times I make it to the end without crashing. I would have liked to run this test IRL, but there are just way too many variables to account for, and also it would just take way too long. But I added a latency simulation in my simulator, which allows me to perfectly dial in the latency of each system. To reach analog latency, you actually need a 240 Hz gaming monitor, and you have to set the latency to 0. And for the other systems, I can add 10 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds, and 40 milliseconds to match them. Okay, many hours of flying and analyzing later, and here are the results. And while it does show a pretty clear trend, the data is honestly kinda trash. There are just way too many human factors impacting the results, and the test is just not consistent enough to give proper data. And I also tested it with my cousin with a slightly different line, and it also shows a very clear trend, but still data is pretty trash. So we need a new test that collects way more data and is more reliable. So I built this little custom app specifically to include some very difficult freestyle maneuvers, like tight turns and gaps, and flying up a staircase, which is pretty latency sensitive. And I added race gates to this track so I can track the time between each gate and then analyze it later. And 2000 attempts later, here are the results. And yeah, this is way better. Now we got some actual data to analyze, and we can make a nice graph like this out of it. And the results vary a bit based on which subsection of the track we look at, but if we choose a difficult part, we have the highest impact of latency, and it's somewhere around 7% slower when going from 15 milliseconds to 25, and about 15% slower when going to 35. When going up all the way to 55 milliseconds, the impact isn't that big anymore, which is a bit surprising. So maybe you already took most of the hit and it doesn't change that much anymore. But I don't know. And these are racing times, and you might wonder, does it matter for freestyle? And yes, it does. Because going fast on this track is really just the same thing as hitting gaps confidently at a higher speed. which is the thing that matters for freestyle the most. And also if you look at the flying itself, it just looks way cleaner on lower latency than on higher latency, with way less corrections and just cleaner flying in general. And clean flying is oftentimes overlooked or brushed off, but it's probably the most important part about freestyle, because if you do a lot of corrections, your video just becomes completely unwatchable because you get motion sickness. So yeah, clean flying in my opinion is way more important than hitting crazy tricks. So 15%? Not that big of a deal, right? Well, do you know what's also 15% slower? It's a Porsche GT2 RS racing against an Audi RSQ8, which is a big old SUV on the Nürburgring. That is 15% slower. I mean, it's a fast SUV, but still it's a big old SUV versus a purpose-built race car. Or if you compare to this game that I like to play, which is Counter-Strike Surf, it's the difference from the world record to a less than average player. So rank 1 out of 24,000 versus rank 14,000 out of 24,000. That's 15% slower. And just for fun, I also did the test while being pretty drunk at somewhere around 1 promille, which is a lot. It's well above any legal driving limits in any country. And the impact is somewhere around 10 milliseconds. So that's one more way to look at it. And I did all the testing with my monitor set to 240 Hz, which is actually required to achieve analog latency. But my monitor can also go up to 480 Hz, which shaves off another like 2 milliseconds or 3 maybe. And the impact in the difficult section is really quite surprising. Just 3 milliseconds is another 5%. So it looks like if you are already very low on the latency and you shave off even a tiny bit, it can have a huge impact. And the whole getting used to high latency is just simply not a thing. Because for the last 5 years, I was always playing Surf on my 144 Hz monitor. And I had very consistent times, always within a few milliseconds. And I could basically no longer improve. But the moment I got my new monitor with 480 Hz, I beat my previous best by a pretty wide margin within like 5 minutes of trying. And with a little bit more grinding, I was able to go from top 15% of the leaderboard to top 8%. Just like that. And this game is purely about precision and smoothness, and you are not reacting to anything. You know the entire map by heart. So you would think latency doesn't have a big effect, but it does. And it's very similar to flying FPV in that regard. And of course I can't just tell you that your setup sucks without giving you any options. So here are 5 things you can do to improve your latency, ranked from easiest to hardest. Number 1, if you're flying DJI with the O4 Air unit, just turn on race mode and it's about a 10 milliseconds gain to normal mode. And if you're flying analog, make sure you have a low latency camera, because that can be a 20 or in some cases even a 40 milliseconds gain just from the camera. And here's a list of known good cameras. Then if you are flying Express LRS, make sure you set it to 500 Hz, because from my experience that's the best trade-off in terms of range versus performance. And to go along with that, you also should turn down your RC smoothing in Betaflight, because on most of these presets the latency is really kinda big, and not only does it add latency, but it also makes your movements way more sluggish. So I would recommend the race preset, but I actually take it one step further, and after loading the racing preset I go into the RC smoothing tab and turn it off completely, so I only keep the feed forward smoothing of this preset, which shaves off another like 1 or 2 milliseconds of latency. Then another thing you should pay attention to is your pit and filter tune. And it's kind of complicated if you do it for the first time, but it makes a pretty big difference. And last but not least, if you're flying analog and you have a high latency goggle, then you might want to consider upgrading that. It's a pretty big investment, but it's definitely worth it.
Kopf anspringt.